That's where the respect and the love comes from. It's not the warm Twitter-pated feeling you have when you pop the question. In this culture, many, especially in Jewish culture, have you ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof? You should, because it gives you a real window into the way the Jews felt. You know how a bride would meet her husband? Why, on their wedding day. Because the matchmaker came to the house and announced that she had found a match. And they would come to an agreement. And the papa would make the deal. And the papa would make sure that the man studied the Torah. The papa would make sure that the man had the ability to feed her, so that, God forbid, he wouldn't have to provide him with food. That's how marriages came about. And what they taught was, you'll learn to love each other. Today, it's all about having a skull full of mush and warm, fuzzy feelings. Here, the issue is speaking to people in that way. So the first one, some people say, is advice to dads. The second one, there were people who were living together and sleeping in the same bed, but not engaging in sexual relationships. It was like a trial marriage. And in that trial marriage, they actually lived together and told everybody they weren't having sex. Bet me. Staying in the same bed, it was a very common practice back then. Sound familiar? And then there was the third group. These were married people who really were devout people. And they were married, but because they had bought into what the culture said about the body being evil, believed that the only godly way, and remember the first question they asked, is it good for a man to touch a woman? They believed that even as married people, that they should not have sex. Now, Paul gives an answer. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Don't seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she is not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh. But I would spare you. By this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as they have none. Those who weep as those who did not weep, those who rejoice as those who did not rejoice, those who buy as those who do not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. So what is Paul saying? If you're married, it's unnatural not for a wife to satisfy her husband in that natural drive, and for a husband not to consider his wife and do what pleases his wife in that natural drive. He's saying the culture got it wrong. And as a result, it does a lot of damage. Now, as some of you may know, some of you may not, but my background is as a Christian counselor. Take a guess at what the number one thing that is cited as a reason for divorce is in this country. Money. It's correct. What's the number two thing? dissatisfied with sex. That's number 2. And it's huge. And Paul gives God's antidote for that. Remember what I said when I started today? That the root cause in a lot of this was they didn't love, not being concerned for one another, and it breaks up families. Well, but I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, and how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin, an unmarried woman. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who marries cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. But if a man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let them marry. Why? Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity. Now, this is the key to the issue of celibacy and remaining as an adult unmarried. Having no necessity. You know what? If you're unmarried and you find that a lot of your thought life is occupied by that drive, unsatisfied, people are called to live celibate lifestyles, and it's a gift. If God has given somebody the gift where they don't have a need for that marital relationship, for sex and marriage, then that gift will relieve them of that pressure. However, if someone does not have that gift, Paul says here in no uncertain terms, you're better to be married. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by the law as long as she lives to her husband. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whoever she wishes, only in the Lord. There is never a time, folks, never a time when a Christian is in the will of God to marry somebody who is not a Christian. Period. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the mind of the Spirit of God. Paul says in no uncertain terms, it's better to marry than to burn in lust. Now, concerning things offered to idols, this is the 8th chapter. We know that we have all knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. Now, this looks like this is just talking about eating things that have been sacrificed to idols. There's a whole backstory here. It was hard to find meat in Corinth that hadn't been offered to some false god. And these temples had a racket. The temple was often connected to a butcher shop. And the meat was cheap. And the reason it was cheap, people brought it as a sacrifice. And the temple got their cut of the meat, and the priest got their cut of the meat, and the rest of it was returned to you to eat in the temple restaurant, and they'd cook it for you. And so the stuff that the temple got went into the temple butcher shop. And they could sell it cheap because they got it for nothing. And it was really common for people to go to the temple butcher shop because they got it at a big discount. Now, what is Paul addressing here? Some young Christians were getting saved, and they were watching older Christians that had a handle on grace and that knew what Paul had taught, that those idols were nothing, man. They were sticks and rocks and all that kind of stuff. They were intricately carved statues. They weren't gods. They were just stone. That's all they were. And some Christians took the attitude, hey, I'm under grace and I have liberty. I know that's not being offered to a real God, so I'm going to take advantage of the cut right price, man. And they would go and do that. But Paul says this, you know what? Some of you guys are using your liberty to really damage new babies in Christ. You're really doing that. And he tells them that you need to be careful about how you're exercising the grace in your life. Because if you damage a brother or a sister in the Lord, these people were having trouble with this. How can you eat meat that you know has been offered to a false god? And they're saying, we know it's not real. We're just catching a bargain. Can I give you the modern day example of this, folks? The year is 1865 to 1880s. The pastor of a Methodist church in London, England, saw that the church had become ritualistic about what they call sacraments. One was communion and the other was baptism. And they were teaching that you can't be saved unless you've been dunked. And they also said that you have to take communion. That's what makes you saved. Well, this pastor felt that things had gotten too ritualistic and that the church had forgotten its mission. So he took the elders and the church members from his church, and they decided that they weren't going to go that direction. And they began ministering to people that couldn't even get in the doors of the Church of England. They went out and they started dealing with alcoholics, and they started dealing with morphine addicts. You remember the dates? 1865 to 1880. Morphine had just been medically approved. Soldiers from the Civil War came home hopelessly addicted to opiates. They ministered to those people, to people who were broke, had nothing, addicted, and in trouble. And they said, those people, they don't need a ceremony. What they need is deliverance from their drugs, their alcohol, and their poverty. And they formed a church organization where they didn't give communion. You know why? They were afraid that even giving non-alcoholic grape juice would entice an alcoholic back into the bottle. That organization grew by the thousands. You know what their name was? The Salvation Army. And to this day, they don't say there's anything wrong with taking communion. They just don't do it in their assemblies. They say it's accepting Jesus and his grace is what makes you saved. Not taking that little grape juice and not eating that cracker. Now, we do practice communion, and we're going to do that today. But we do it because we believe it's making a statement to each other and to the world that I believe in the New Testament that God has written me into. I'm saved. And I'm saved because of the blood of Jesus, and I'm saved because of his body broken for me. These people that made a decision against that, they did it with a right heart. As long as the real problem that Paul is addressing here doesn't become an issue. They did one other thing too. Because of the potential for dragging alcoholics back into alcohol, and there were 100,000 people just on the waterfront of England who were alcoholics. Church of England refused not to give communion with that wine. They walked out, they formed the organization over those two sacraments. But then there were those in that movement, in my humble opinion, kind of lost track of the fact that the reason that they chose not to drink alcoholic beverages was because they were in sympathy with the downtrodden that they were working with, because they knew you should not be a stumbling block to your brother. And because of that, over the years, it became a deal where people who were not affected in that way, if they drank any kind of alcohol, a glass of wine or anything, there are those that said, oh, you're going to hell. The Bible doesn't say that any place. What it cautions against is being fallen down drunk. Now let's go back and look what Paul's talking about. Now, concerning things offered to idols, we know that we have knowledge. Listen, I understand that you more mature Christians know that those false idols are not gods, and that that meat is not being sacrificed to